Hi, this is Miss Vitale. This podcast on the nervous system is intended for my AP Biology students. Your own nervous system is much more complex than a computer. The human nervous system is probably the most intricately organized aggregate of matter on Earth. 1 cc of brain tissue equals about 50 million nerve cells. There are 3 overlapping functions of the nervous system. The first is sensory input. This is when sensory receptors collect information about external and internal environments. For example, light-detecting cells in your eyes are sensory receptors. The information is then sent to the integration centers. Integration is when the input is interpreted and associated with the appropriate response. It's carried out in the CNS, or the central nervous system. This includes the brain and the spinal cord. Motor output is when the conduction of signals from the integration centers go to the CNS and then to effector cells. The effector cells carry out the response. Effector cells are muscles or glands. Nerves are simply rope-like bundles of extensions of neurons tightly wrapped in connective tissue. The peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, are the nerves that communicate between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. The structure of the neuron or nerve cell begins with the cell body. The cell body contains the nucleus and other organelles. Then the dendrites are the short, highly branched processes that receive information from other cells. The axons are longer and send out messages to other cells and can be over 3 feet long. The axon hillock is the point where the axon joins the cell body, and the myelin sheath is the insulating layer on the axon. The neuron is the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. The synaptic terminals are the ends of the axons. They release neurotransmitters or chemical messengers into the synapse. The synapse is the site where the synaptic terminals contact the target cell, which again is going to be a neuron or an effector. The presynaptic cell is the transmitting cell, and the postsynaptic cell is the target cell. A reflex is the simplest type of nerve circuit. Sensory neurons receive information from the receptors. The information is passed to the motor neuron, which signals the effector cell. Interneurons communicate with other neurons. Ganglion is a cluster of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Ganglia is plural. Glia are the supporting cells between the neurons. They are for structural support. Schwann cells are glia that forms the myelin sheath. The nodes of Ranvier are the spaces between the Schwann cells. It is the only place on the axon where signals can be transmitted, because the myelin sheath insulates the rest. The signals jump from node to node, making it faster and more efficient than traveling straight down the axon. It covers over 330 miles per hour, and without the myelin sheath and the jumping from node to node, it would travel much more slowly at about 14 feet per minute. Multiple sclerosis is when your immune system destroys the myelin sheath. This results in a loss of conduction in the nerves, a loss of muscle control, and brain function. There are many different drugs being tried, but drugs that suppress the immune system can be helpful. The membrane potential is the different concentrations of ions inside and outside of the cell. It causes an electrical charge difference. Anions are more concentrated inside the cell, and cations are more concentrated outside the cell. The resting potential is the membrane potential of a neuron in the resting state. It is not transmitting an electrical signal. It is unstimulated. The membrane of the neuron keeps large molecules like proteins with a negative charge inside the cell. The membrane also uses protein pumps to pump ions through. While resting, potassium ions are not moved out. Sodium ions are moved out. This is accomplished through sodium-potassium pumps and other protein channels. This creates a negative charge inside the cell and a positive charge outside the cell. A stimulus causes a nerve signal to be generated. An action potential is a nerve signal. Its changes in the membrane potential and can result in an electrical impulse. Neurons have gated ion channels that open and close in response to a stimulus. The ion concentration changes, therefore changing the membrane potential. Different types of ion channels respond to chemicals or neurotransmitters or to voltage, like changes in the membrane potential. The threshold potential is the minimum change in a membrane's voltage that must occur to generate a nerve signal or an action potential. Once the threshold potential is reached, a nerve signal is triggered. Quickly, the inside of the cell becomes more positive than the outside. The membrane quickly repolarizes as the voltage drops back down. It goes below the resting potential and then returns to the resting potential. The quick change of the membrane potential is caused by the quick movement of ions. The action potential only occurs at one point on the neuron's membrane, on the axon or near the cell body.
A nerve impulse is an electrical current that travels along dendrites or axons due to ions moving through voltage-gated channels in the neuron's plasma membrane. Voltage-gated channels open and close in response to an electrical voltage, so they are affected by changes in electrical charge around them. When a neuron is at rest, a charge difference is maintained between the inside and outside of the cell. This charge difference is produced and maintained largely by active transport using sodium-potassium pumps. The pumps send sodium ions out of the cell and bring potassium ions in. While other channels allow some flow of potassium ions back out of the cell, the sodium ions cannot easily get back in to replace the lost positive charges. The overall result is that the exterior of the cell has a net positive charge and the interior has a net negative charge. The difference in charge between the interior and exterior of the cell is called the resting membrane potential. A nerve impulse begins when a stimulus disturbs the plasma membrane on a dendrite, causing sodium channels to open. Sodium ions flow into the cell, lessening the charge difference at that location. If the change is enough, it will cause nearby voltage-gated sodium channels to open. This allows so many sodium ions to flood into the cell at that location that the membrane there is depolarized, with the local region inside the cell having a net positive charge and the outside of the cell having a net negative charge. This affects neighboring voltage-gated sodium channels, which then open, moving the depolarization along the membrane. This moving depolarization is called an action potential. Changes occur behind the action potential to restore the resting membrane potential. The voltage-gated sodium channels close and voltage-gated potassium channels open. This allows a rapid flow of potassium ions out of the cell, repolarizing the membrane so that the inside is again negative and the outside positive. This is followed by use of sodium-potassium pumps to fully restore the resting membrane potential and to reestablish proper concentrations of sodium and potassium ions inside and outside the cell.
A synapse is a junction between two neurons or between a neuron and an effector cell. Electrical synapses, or action potentials, go directly from the first cell to the second cell. This is common in areas where steady contractions occur, like in the heart and the GI tract. Gap junctions between the first and second cell are channels that allow ions to flow from cell to cell. Chemical synapses have a synaptic cleft, and they're similar to what we described earlier. The synaptic cleft separates the first and second cells, so the ions cannot be transmitted directly. This would occur in skeletal muscles. The cytoplasm at the tip of the first cell contains sacs called synaptic vesicles. They contain thousands of molecules of neurotransmitters. The action potential of the first cell causes the synaptic vesicles to fuse with the plasma membrane, releasing their neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. This is done through exocytosis. The neurotransmitters bind to receptor molecules on the second cell. The ion channels open, and ions diffuse into the second cell, creating a new action potential. Enzymes then break down the neurotransmitters, closing the ion channels. There are lots of different types of neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, for example, is found in the brain and between the neurons and muscles. It can excite, like cause skeletal muscles to contract, or it can inhibit, like slowing down the heart rate. Biogenic amines are neurotransmitters made from amino acids. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine are all examples of biogenic amines. Things like serotonin and dopamine affect sleep, mood, attention, and learning. Certain substances can affect neurotransmitters. For example, caffeine reverses inhibiting neurotransmitters. Nicotine activates acetylcholine receptors, and alcohol increases inhibitors. There are different types of nervous systems. Simple nerve net is found in things like cnidarians, and it is the simplest type of nervous system. It's really just a web of neurons, and it has no brain. Cephalization is the concentration of the nervous system in the head, and centralization is the presence of the CNS and the PNS. Vertebrates are highly cephalized and centralized. The spinal cord receives the information from the peripheral nervous system, and the brain acts as the master control center. Blood vessels in the brain have a blood-brain barrier, which are very selective as to what goes into the brain tissue. Ventricles are spaces in the center of the brain. They are filled with fluid, and they drain into the central canal of the spinal cord. In the ventricle, capillaries secrete cerebral spinal fluid, which cushions the central nervous system. It supplies nutrients, hormones, and white blood cells. The meninges is a connective tissue layer that surrounds and protects the brain and the spinal cord. Cerebral spinal fluid between two of the layers creates a cushion. White matter, because it's covered with myelin, is the outer part of the spinal cord, and it is mainly made of axons. Gray matter is the inside of the spinal cord, and it's mainly composed of the cell bodies and dendrites of neurons. Cranial nerves go to and from the brain, and spinal nerves go to and from the spinal cord. Both of these are parts of the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system begins with the sensory and motor divisions. The sensory division is also called the afferent division. Incoming nerves from sensory receptors of the external and internal environment make up the sensory division. The motor division is also called the efferent. Outgoing nerves from the CNS to the effector cells make up the motor division. The motor division has two divisions, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system carries signals to the skeletal muscles in response to external stimuli. This is voluntary, and we have conscious control over it. The autonomic nervous system carries signals that regulate the internal environment, such as muscles of the cardiac, digestive, excretory, and endocrine systems. This is not voluntary, and we do not have any control over it. The autonomic system is divided into two systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division controls arousal and energy generation, and arousal in the sense of waking or getting excited or getting energized. It is also involved in the flight or fight syndrome and strenuous exercise. When the sympathetic division has control, your heart rate goes up, your respiration goes up, your digestion drops, the liver starts to convert glycogen into glucose for energy, and adrenaline is released, or epinephrine. The parasympathetic division is the opposite. Your heart rate goes down, your digestion increases, energy is stored in the form of glycogen, and this is during resting and calm times and for maintenance of the body. There are three hollow bulges at the anterior end of the neural tube in the embryo, and they form the brain. There's the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain becomes the cerebrum. It is an outgrowth of the forebrain. The cerebrum evolved in complex vertebrates, and it is the largest in birds and mammals. The brain stem is the anterior of the spinal cord, or at the top of the spinal cord. There's three parts. The medulla oblongata contains centers that control visceral functions, things that are necessary for life, like breathing, heart rate, swallowing, and digestion. The pons also controls visceral activities. And the midbrain is for auditory data, visual reflexes. It sends sensory data to higher brain centers. Sleep and arousal are controlled by several centers in the brainstem and the cerebrum. An EEG, or an electroencephalogram, measures brain waves, or the electrical activity of the brain. The cerebellum is the coordination and error checking center. This occurs during motor, perceptual, and cognitive performances. Things like learning and remembering motor responses and hand-eye coordination. The thalamus is the main input center for sensory information going to the cerebrum, and the main output center for information leaving the cerebrum. It sorts incoming information and sends it to the appropriate higher brain centers. It receives information that regulates emotion and arousal. The hypothalamus, which you already learned about in the endocrine system, is the most important region for regulating homeostasis. It makes two types of hormones, the posterior pituitary hormones and releasing hormones. It contains the thermostat. It regulates things like hunger and thirst and basic survival mechanisms. Sex and mating behavior are controlled here. Fight or flight are controlled here, and it is the pleasure center. We experience rhythmic behavior or daily rhythms, like, for example, when do we eat, when do we sleep, when do we wake, when do we peak. Circadian rhythm refers to a 24-hour cycle. It persists even in the absence of external cues. Circadian rhythm is the biological clock. That's a strong internal component that regulates these rhythms. In mammals, the SCN is in the hypothalamus, and it functions as a biological clock. Basically, the SCN is a pair of structures whose cells produce proteins in response to light and dark. The cerebrum is the most highly evolved structure of the mammalian brain, and it's divided into the right and left hemispheres. Each hemisphere has an outer covering of gray matter. The cerebral cortex, the gray matter, is the largest and most complex part of the brain, and it has evolved the most. Then there's the internal white matter and the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei is a cluster of nuclei deep within the white matter. It's important for movement, and damage to it can cause things like Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. The neocortex is an additional outer layer of the cortex, and it's only found in mammals. It's associated with greater cognitive abilities and more sophisticated behavior. It's relative to size and presence of convolutions, which increase the surface area. The human neocortex contains about a half a square meter of surface area. It is 80% of the total brain mass. It is the largest in humans, and the porpoise has the second largest. The left cerebral cortex is responsible for the right side of the body, and vice versa. The corpus callosum is a thick band of fibers that communicates between the right and the left sides. The cerebral cortex has 4 lobes: the frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes. The motor cortex sends commands to the skeletal muscles. The somatosensory cortex is for touch, pain, pressure, and temperature sensing. The Broca's area is for speaking. It is in the frontal lobe in front of the motor cortex. The Wernicke's area is posterior of the temporal lobe, and it comprehends speech. The limbic system is a ring around the brainstem. It contains sections of the thalamus and hypothalamus with the hippocampus and the olfactory cortex. It is central to behaviors. Things like nurturing infants and bonding with infants and other people distinguish mammals from other animals. Laughing and crying and a lot of other feelings are generated in the limbic system. Short-term memory occurs in the frontal lobe, long-term memory in the hippocampus. Consciousness is experience ourselves as sensing, acting, feeling, and thinking about the past and the future. How many of these capabilities extend to other animals is still a big debate.